In 1939, the British Army relied on horses and railways to move most of its supplies. Within 5 years, more than 100,000 lorries formed the backbone of the greatest amphibious invasion in history. Official accounts celebrate the heroics on the Normandy beaches, but they rarely mention that 91,000 vehicles were abandoned at Dunkirk, or how a shortage of standardised trucks nearly doomed the campaign before it began. This is the hidden story of how Britain's supply lines, held together by hastily rebuilt civilian lorries and bold industrial reforms, determined the fate of D-Day, and why, behind every tank and every advance, the true victory depended not on firepower, but on logistics. The scale of collapse and transformation behind these British lorries is almost never told. So how did a nation rebuild its entire wartime transport from crisis to triumph in just a few years? Britain entered the Second World War with a supply chain rooted in the past. Railways carried 80% of army supplies, and horses still outnumbered trucks by 7-1 in frontline divisions. The British Army fielded barely 4,000 lorries, most of them civilian models pressed into service, many already worn out. When war broke out, the government scrambled to requisition every available truck from farms, factories and city streets. This sudden mix, over 100 different makes and models, brought chaos to the Army's workshops and convoys. Spare parts rarely fit, and breakdowns stranded vehicles across the countryside. The crisis reached its peak at Dunkirk in the spring of 1940. As German forces closed in, the British Expeditionary Force abandoned 91,000 vehicles on the beaches, almost every lorry, car and motorcycle left behind. The loss was staggering, wiping out the bulk of Britain's motor transport in a single week. What remained at home was a patchwork of aging trucks, unreliable and ill-suited for military needs. Railways and horses could not keep pace with the demands of modern war, and the army faced the prospect of fighting with a crippled logistics backbone. Britain now stood at a crossroads, rebuild from scratch or risk defeat by supply shortages, not enemy fire. The scale of vulnerability was clear. Without decisive action, the road to victory would remain blocked by empty depots and broken down trucks. In the aftermath of Dunkirk, Britain's military supply system faced a reckoning. The Ministry of Supply stepped in with a directive that would reshape the entire industry, limit the Army's heavy lorries to a handful of standardised designs with the 3-ton truck at the centre. Gone were the days of 100 different makes and models clogging up depots and workshops. The new policy slashed the official design list to just 15 types. Factories were ordered to retool their lines and focus on producing these approved models in bulk. Engines, axles and gearboxes were standardised so a single spare part could fit across multiple vehicles. This stripped away complexity and confusion, allowing mechanics to repair trucks in the field using one set of tools and a common stock of spares. The benefits were immediate and dramatic. Production rates soared. By 1942, output of military lorries had tripled. Downtime from breakdowns and maintenance dropped by 40%. Convoys rolled with fewer delays and supply lines could be rebuilt quickly after losses. The 3-ton, 4x2 and 4x4 lorries became the backbone of this new system, balancing capacity with reliability and ease of handling. For manufacturers, the ministry's mandate meant a complete realignment of priorities. Civilian vehicle lines were converted almost overnight into war production engines, coordinated on a national scale. The focus was no longer on variety or innovation, but on sheer volume and interchangeability, a strategy that would underpin every logistical success to come. Bedford's Luton plant, Leyland's Lancashire works, and the factories of Albion, Austin, Guy and AEC became the beating heart of Britain's wartime truck production. Civilian assembly lines, once busy with buses and delivery vans, switched overnight to military lorries. By 1943, Bedford alone was turning out over 1,000 QL trucks every month, while Leyland's Retriever and Austin's K5 models poured from retooled lines at a relentless pace. Albion's Scottstown factory, battered by air raids, still managed to deliver thousands of CX series trucks, each with a 3-ton payload and a reputation for reliability in rough terrain. The numbers told a story of scale and urgency. More than 52,000 Bedford QL trucks rolled out of Luton between 1941 and 1945. Leyland built about 8,000 retrievers, Austin produced 12,000 K5 trucks, and AEC Matador artillery tractors, vital for moving heavy guns, topped 8,000 units. Across the country, production lines ran around the clock. Output surged even as Luftwaffe bombs fell on industrial cities. In Coventry and Luton, air raids forced workers to take shelter, but delays were measured in hours, not days. Standardised parts and shared components meant that assembly could resume quickly, with mechanics and fitters swapping in whatever was available. The workforce behind this effort changed almost as rapidly as the machines themselves. By 1943, women made up half the labour force at many plants. At Vauxhall in Luton, more than 4,000 women worked 12-hour night shifts, assembling chassis and riveting gearboxes under blackout conditions. An assembler recalled that bombs shook the line and that standard bolts let them rivet chassis in half the time, during 12-hour nights with no stops. Even after a raid in April 1943 damaged a fifth of the plant, production barely slowed. The drive for standardization and interchangeable parts allowed the factories to recover, adapt, and keep the trucks coming. Britain's war effort depended not just on new machines, but on the hands that built them, tired, determined, and unyielding under pressure. Bedford's QL series entered service in 1941, answering the Army's demand for a truly modern, all-terrain truck. Designed from the ground up for military use, the QL featured a 4x4 drive system, a 3-ton payload, and a 6-cylinder petrol engine producing 72 horsepower. The forward control cab kept the vehicle compact, just over 15 feet long, making it easier to manoeuvre on narrow lanes and crowded depots. Simplicity defined every aspect of the QL. Mechanics could swap out a magneto or an oil sump in minutes, and the modular chassis accepted a wide range of body types. The result was a truck that could be adapted for almost any task the war demanded. Production at Bedford's Luton plant ran day and night, with over 52,000 QLs built between 1941 and 1945. This made it the most numerous British military lorry of the war. The QL's main variant, the QLD, served as a general cargo carrier, but the design's flexibility led to a host of specialised versions. Fuel tankers with 500-gallon drums kept the front lines moving, while QLR wireless trucks carried radio equipment for command units. Workshop bodies turned the QL into rolling repair shops, and troop carriers could move nearly 30 soldiers at a time. Each variant shared the same core mechanical parts, streamlining repairs and supply. The QL's reliability was proven across every theatre, from the deserts of North Africa to the muddy lanes of Normandy. Its oil bath air filter stood up to dust, and the 4x4 drivetrain powered through mud and rubble. Compared to the American GMC CCKW, the QL was slightly smaller and lighter, but just as versatile. Both trucks formed the backbone of their nation's supply columns, but the QL's adaptability and ease of maintenance made it a favourite among British and Commonwealth crews. As the Army prepared for the challenges of D-Day, the QL was ready, tested, trusted, and built for the road ahead. Across southern England, the countryside filled with lines of parked lorries, Bedford QLs, Austin K5s, and Leylands, waiting in silent rows for embarkation orders. In the weeks before D-Day, over 150,000 vehicles were gathered at depots from Hampshire to Sussex. Each truck, regardless of model, faced the same transformation: waterproofing. Mechanics and depot crews worked in shifts, fitting raised breather pipes to engines, sealing electrics with thick coats of bitumen, and stretching tarpaulin over cabs and cargo beds. The work was repetitive and exacting, and it demanded precision. A missed seam or a poorly sealed distributor could mean a drowned engine and a stranded convoy on the beaches of Normandy. A single fault could stop a vehicle where recovery was almost impossible, and the consequences could be fatal for a moving supply line. Depot schedules ran with military discipline, sometimes processing 1,000 vehicles a day. Standard kits included flexible metal trunking for air intakes, steel extensions for exhausts, and waterproof ignition sets. The goal was simple: make each lorry capable of wading through up to 4 feet of seawater. Rain and mud made the work grueling, and not every kit fit perfectly. Failure rates hovered around 10%, but depot teams doubled back, applying extra sealant and retesting until every vehicle passed. Sergeant Harris, a Royal Army Service Corps planner, described the scene at Camp C7. He recalled that crews raised breather pipes 1.5 feet and tarped every cab. One storm could lose half their trucks to the surf, so they could not risk it. Under his watch, convoys of newly waterproofed lorries rolled out, assault-ready, marked for embarkation, and one step closer to the Channel crossing. British lorries first touched French soil from the cavernous holds of landing ship tanks, known as LSTs, designed to carry up to 20 trucks or 1,500 tons of cargo each. Crews worked in tight, noisy quarters, guiding vehicles into position for the journey across the Channel. On June 6, 1944, the first assault waves prioritised tanks and infantry, but by midday, convoys of Bedfords, Austins and Leylands rumbled down steel ramps straight into the surf. Waterproofing paid off as engines roared through 4 feet of water, exhaust pipes hissing, tarpaulins dripping with salt spray. Unloading on open beaches was slow and hazardous. A single LST might take 8 to 12 hours to empty, with beach groups racing the tide and enemy artillery. Royal Engineers cleared minefields and bulldozed exits, carving rough tracks through shingle and sand to reach the narrow roads beyond. Traffic jams built up quickly. 1,000 vehicles could arrive in a single tide, and every minute of delay risked drawing fire from German guns hidden inland. The arrival of Mulberry B at Arromanches changed the tempo. This artificial harbour, built from sunken caissons and floating piers, allowed up to 20,000 tons of stores a day to flow ashore by late June. Lorries rolled off ships onto floating roadways, bypassing the chaos of the open beaches. Within 3 days, British supply columns were pushing inland, delivering ammunition, fuel and rations to the front lines. The speed of this operation, moving thousands of vehicles under threat, was a feat of organisation and nerve, laying the groundwork for the advance into Normandy. Normandy's countryside put British lorries and their crews to the test. Narrow lanes twisted between ancient hedgerows, barely wide enough for 2 trucks to pass. Dust rose in thick clouds during dry spells, choking air filters and grinding into every moving part. After rain, those same roads turned to mud, swallowing wheels and bogging down even the best 4x4s. Tyre shortages became a daily worry by July. New spares were rare, so drivers patched punctures with whatever rubber they could scrounge or cut usable tyres from wrecked trucks abandoned in ditches. Most drivers doubled as mechanics. A breakdown did not mean waiting for help, it meant crawling under the truck with a wrench, often with shells bursting nearby. Diaries describe roadside repairs under fire, gearboxes swapped in half an hour, and makeshift fixes using parts cannibalised from disabled vehicles. Dust-clogged oil bath filters so quickly that cleaning them became a nightly ritual, hands black with grit and diesel. One Royal Army Service Corps driver wrote, "We stripped a wheel in 20 minutes flat, patched the tube and rolled on. If you stopped too long, you'd fall behind, or worse." Long hours blurred into each other. 18-hour shifts were common, with drivers snatching sleep in the cab or on a pile of tarpaulins. Every mile carried the risk of breakdown or ambush, but the columns kept moving, patching themselves together with ingenuity and stubbornness. Keeping the trucks rolling was as much a battle as anything at the front. An armoured division in Normandy burned through 600 to 700 tons of supplies every day. More than half of that was for fuel alone. Each tank required dozens of gallons to move a few miles, and every artillery barrage emptied lorries full of shells almost as quickly as they arrived. The daily arithmetic of war was unyielding. Without a constant flow of petrol, oil and ammunition, advances stalled and firepower faded. British supply columns built around the standardised 3-ton lorries delivered these essentials across a patchwork of battered roads and temporary bridges. By late July, the 21st Army Group was consuming up to 20,000 tons a day, with over 150,000 vehicles landed since D-Day. Road transport became the backbone, as railways lay smashed and ports struggled to keep pace. During the American breakout at Operation Cobra, British and Commonwealth supply lines mirrored the intensity of the US Red Ball Express. Lorry convoys stretched for miles, their loads dictating the tempo of battle. Every mile gained in France was measured in tons delivered, not just in ground taken. Victory depended on wheels turning, engines running, and drivers pushing through exhaustion to keep the front supplied. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, Britain faced a new challenge. What to do with the vast fleets of military lorries that had kept the war machine moving? The War Department's Surplus Vehicle Disposal Board began the enormous task of auctioning off tens of thousands of trucks. These included Bedford QLs, Austin K5S, Leylands and Albions, sold between 1945 and 1947. In some months, more than 10,000 vehicles changed hands. Each vehicle was inspected and graded before being sold to anyone who could pay. For many, these lorries became the first trucks of the post-war haulage industry. Demobilised soldiers and small-time entrepreneurs snapped them up, repurposing army green Bedfords into delivery vans, builders' wagons, and even makeshift buses. Across bombed-out cities, these surplus vehicles hauled bricks, timber, and machinery for reconstruction, their military stencils fading beneath new coats of paint. This work helped clear rubble and carried the materials of renewal, the reliability and simplicity that had made them indispensable in Normandy. Now gave Britain a practical foundation for rebuilding. Their mechanical simplicity meant local repair, local parts, and quick returns to service. By the late 1940s, the backbone of the country's road transport was made up of ex-army trucks, their origins still visible in the shape of a cab or the stamp of a Ministry of Supply plate. Wartime logistics had not only supplied victory, but seeded the revival of Britain's roads and industries for decades to come. Today, every modern supply chain owes a debt to those wartime lorries, the Bedford QL, Austin K5 and Leyland Retriever. They proved that logistics wins wars. As global crises test transport networks, the lesson remains. Reliability and adaptability move history forward, not glamour. The next challenge won't wait for a hero. It will depend on what is ready to roll. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts below.